Welcome, everyone. I'm Penny Lewis, the Executive Director of the Ecological Landscape Alliance, and I'll be the moderator for today's webinar, The Wet and Wild World of Constructed Wetlands. This is part of the Focus on Sustainability webinar series developed by a group of organizations known regionally for their quality ecological education. By collaborating on these webinars, we expand the reach of our regional programs across the country. In case you're not familiar with our organizations, they're largely nonprofit and volunteer groups in the United States. The regional groups are the Ecological Landscape Alliance, the Chesapeake Conservation Landscaping Council, Deep Roots Kansas City, and Rescape California. And now I'd like to introduce our presenters, who are colleagues from the Horsley Witten group.
Thank you, Penny. This is Brian Kuchar, Principal Landscape Architect and Professional Engineer.
This is Michelle West, Senior Water Resources Engineer with 17 years of experience.
And this is Jennifer Relstab. I'm a Water Resources Engineer as well, with about 14 years of experience and out of the Boston office.
So thank you all today for joining us for our discussion on the wet and wild world of constructed wetlands. Just a quick clarification before we get started. This presentation is not about wetlands designed to replace or restore existing systems, but focuses on design wetlands that treat stormwater runoff and are located in areas where a wetland did not previously exist. So this is the third time Michelle, Jen, and I have given this presentation, and we are feeling a bit like traveling preachers. So we are here today to spread the word and the good news about constructed wetlands in all of their various forms. We have come to love designing constructed wetlands for stormwater treatment. In our experience, we have found this particular GSI practice is often underutilized and can be underappreciated for the multifunctional benefits they provide beyond just stormwater treatment. Today, we will provide a brief overview of the different types of practices, or what we like to call the wet part of the presentation, which includes a discussion on the what, why, and where. This will be followed by the wild, which will include 6 case studies and some wild things we have learned through the years. We will then wrap up with some Q&A, so let's begin.
So if you are geeks like us, you might lie awake at night pondering important philosophical stormwater questions. What if stormwater practices actually enhance not only water quality, but ecological function as well? So this graphic shows the continuum of stormwater practices and their function. Green stormwater infrastructure, also referred to as GSI, has come a long way in recent years from the traditional wet and dry ponds, or as we like to call them, holes in the ground. But there still seems to be a missing link. Most of the focus remains on the filtering and infiltration categories, which, don't get me wrong, are great in many applications. But the storage practices, constructed wetland options in particular, seem overlooked in many GSI initiatives and programs. This may be because constructed wetlands are generally misunderstood by the public. People worry about mosquitoes, believe they will look ugly, and don't think they can be used in urban sites, just as a few examples. We hope that by getting more successful constructed wetlands installed, we can start to change this false narrative. So what are constructed stormwater wetlands? These are the multifunctional practices that mimic natural wetland processes to treat stormwater runoff and provide other wetland benefits such as habitat and increased resiliency. While there are many ways to tweak the design based on site conditions and stormwater objectives, we typically consider 3 main types of constructed wetlands: wet swales, shallow marsh systems, and gravel wetlands. The rule of thumb for sizing is that wet swales and shallow marsh systems typically need a footprint that is about 1.5% of the total drainage area to meet treatment goals, while gravel wetlands can provide great water quality treatment in a smaller space, only about 0.35% of the drainage area. The simplest and usually the smallest constructed wetland is the wet swale. This linear practice works with the existing high groundwater table and wetland plants to create a somewhat uniform wetland system. As a result, the wet swale is somewhat single note with little depth variation and thus not as much habitat diversity. They are typically small-scale practices just for water quality treatment rather than extended storage for large storm events. For even better water quality treatment, designers are just starting to play around with some enhancements for this practice, such as submerged baskets of wood chips for increased nutrient removal by microbes. So stay tuned to see where the wet swale can go. The shallow marsh system is the design that most people think of when they hear constructed wetlands. This practice mimics natural marshes in both form and function. The best designs create different wetland zones throughout the site using microtopography, from deep pools, around 4 feet deep or maybe even deeper, to so-called islands that are rarely inundated but will have hydric soil. Shallow marshes can easily provide water quality treatment, and depending on the space available, they can also provide storage for flood control. This practice does take up a lot of space, but it provides the best habitat of the wetland options. People do have concerns about mosquitoes with the shallow marsh, but research has shown that these practices also provide habitat for mosquito predators, and that mosquitoes are much more prevalent in common practices like deep sump catch basins than in the constructed wetlands. The gravel wetland provides a uniform wetland zone with no or little open water, but rather with a saturated gravel bed. We found that the most versatile and effective gravel wetland design to use is to create an upflow filter. This is done by directing stormwater from a pretreatment practice at a higher elevation down into the bottom of the practice in these chambers, and then it filters up through the gravel and overflows in an outlet structure. Stormwater, gravel wetlands tend to have the highest pollutant removal rates, particularly for nitrogen, due to the microbial activity in the anaerobic zone created down at the bottom of the system. There are different design variants that do use an organic planting soil layer on the top of the gravel, but we prefer planting directly into the gravel itself. There are several species that tolerate these conditions, such as the three-square bulrush, soft rush, and tussock sedge, just to name a few. By avoiding the organic layer, you will also avoid creating a nutrient input to the system from the soil, since usually one of your stormwater goals will be to remove nutrients. So you don't want to be adding it with the soil. Planting construction wetlands is actually more straightforward than planting many other green stormwater infrastructure practices, both at the design stage and then maintaining the wetland in the long run. It entails creating a self-sustaining wetland community, selecting plants from a relatively short list of wetland species that can grow within a specific water depth range or hydrologic regime. But because of this close correlation between wetland species and water depth, planting layout needs to be field adjusted as needed. For example, grading shifts during construction due to unexpected utilities or any number of fun surprises that can occur. Plant layout also needs to shift, or the plants could die from too little or perhaps too much water. So it is even more important for these wetland designs that the landscape architect provide some contractor oversight during plant layout.
So why does this matter? Why are wetlands important to stormwater? Well, wetlands address pollutants that are currently impacting many of our waterways, primarily nitrogen and phosphorus, as Michelle mentioned, through the processes of filtration, uptake through plants and microbial systems, and absorption. Wetlands can be an effective way to address pollutants from stormwater through various functions, whether end of pipe, through large or small drainage areas, and they're generally fairly cost effective. They can also help to meet some of the regulations, one of them being meeting total maximum daily limits, or TMDLs. These are planning documents that address pollutant loadings and associated reductions for waterway restoration, and we often use these documents as a reference for many of the planning processes that we go through when we look at implementing best management practices. Another of the requirements is the Municipal Separate Storm Sewer System, MS4 permit requirement, which is the 2016 permit, which was recently effected July 1st, 2018. Under this has 6 minimum control measures that allows us to look at a little bit better how we can manage stormwater under the TMDL, but also under other requirements, and that's where wetlands can be best implemented. Thinking a little bit forward, climate resiliency will be important. What will the future bring? Sea level rise is one of them. Submerged outfalls will be important to consider. Greater storm intensity and frequency, so more flooding and more storm surge. Greater annual precipitation and more extremes, so wind can be a factor, and higher groundwater elevations, in particular in coastal locations. Constructed wetlands offer a nature-based solution to these conditions. It's adaptable compared to gray infrastructure, and vegetation communities can often evolve to match site conditions and convert from dry to wet species depending on the conditions. A sufficient capacity can be provided under these systems as compared to some smaller systems or gray systems in particular to evolve under these larger storms and flooding conditions. But even beyond the regulatory compliance and climate adaptation, there are several reasons why constructed wetlands are valuable as a stormwater practice to communities. First, they provide habitat for wildlife, waterfowl, birds, reptiles like turtles, frogs, and toads, as well as muskrats, minks, and sometimes beavers, depending on where you're at. They also create or enhance existing open spaces, particularly degraded urban areas, and they're aesthetically pleasing during all seasons. In the spring and the summer, they provide green and flowering, or in the fall, winter, they provide various colors to sort of draw the eye. Constructed wetlands can also provide a focal point or backdrop to passive recreation, such as walkways and pathways, or contemplation, such as benches, and can be a place where people gather to enjoy nature. And lastly, per the area treated, these systems are, again, low cost for the water quality benefit that they provide, and are designed to have minimal maintenance so that these practices are more sustainable for city budgets in the long term.
So, where do they go? All are adaptable to sites with high water tables or along the water's edge, but they can also be designed with an impermeable liner to hold water to create the wetland, or be a great end-of-pipe solution to treat stormwater runoff prior to discharge to an existing wetland or water body. So, for example, the wet swales. They're great for linear spaces, naturalized areas, waterfronts, and buffers. They're highly adaptable. They typically provide a smaller habitat due to their size, and they can be part of a larger resiliency strategy. Shallow marshes are well suited for large open spaces, naturalized areas, waterfront, floodplains, and buffers as well. They require a larger area or footprint relative to the drainage area. They also provide greater habitat due to the shallow and deep pools, and also provide great resiliency solutions. Gravel wetlands are better for tighter spaces or maybe less naturalized areas, and tend to be a bit more engineered. Their footprint or their area is smaller relative to the contributing drainage area. They traditionally provide less habitat, and that's mainly due to the lack of standing water or no pools. And then from a resiliency standpoint, they'd probably be on the lower end of your resiliency options. When the conditions are right, all of these practices should be considered. Maybe at a large site on the periphery of the urban environment, such as the Alewife Stormwater Wetland in Boston, designed by the Bioengineering Group in the upper right here, or integrated into the urban fabric and bringing the natural environment into our cities, such as the Thornton Creek Water Quality Swale in Seattle, designed by SBR, or at a smaller, less ambitious site, but still highly effective as part of a skate park and waterfront bike path along Lake Champlain in Burlington, Vermont. So we know where they go, but what about the site context and how it applies to constructed wetland design? Context goes beyond the where and existing site conditions, and it includes the specific function or use, the environmental or ecology, as well as the experience or feel of the site. Depending upon the project scale and size, some sites may be comprised of more than one context. Some examples that might be encountered may include the waterfront, woodlands, meadows, hardscape or plazas, parking lots, and rights-of-ways, and there can certainly be others. So why does this matter? Identifying the context not only provides designers with the valuable information to better integrate the practice into the surrounding environment, but can inform the anticipated type and frequency of maintenance. We also know, unlike traditional drainage design, the location and selection of GSI practices is not a one-size-fits-all approach. These are nature-based systems, and not like And just like all good landscape design, context does matter. We also know that when you consider and design for the context, you can greatly increase the likelihood of the project's success and long-term maintenance, as well as provide multifunctional benefits beyond stormwater, such as new opportunities for people to interact with and appreciate nature, as well as create much-needed habitat in our built landscapes. So that ends the wet portion of the presentation, and you should all be gravel and, well, shallow marsh experts by now. And we will begin the into the wild portion. We will present 6 case studies of each practice type with varying sizes and within various contexts. Each case study will include a few wild lessons learned. Also, just to keep things interesting, there is a non-technical theme throughout the presentation. Hopefully by the end, a few of you might have picked up on it and will let us know and you can identify it. So our first case study is called Saturday in the Park. What is it? It's a wet swale that treats 1 acre of impervious cover. It was built in 2013. Why? It was for water quality improvement as part of a TMDL and also provided park improvements and buffer restoration. Where? It was located in Roger Williams Park in Providence, Rhode Island, and it was built through Narragansett Bay Restoration Funds. The approximate cost is $165,000 per impervious acre treated, and the context for this particular site was identified as waterfront. So just a little background. Roger Williams Park is comprised of 435 acres and includes 7 ponds accounting for 100+ acres. Unfortunately, like many of the water bodies in our historic landscapes, the ponds are impaired for phosphorus and have an ongoing issue with frequent algae blooms and toxic cyanobacteria. A TMDL for phosphorus was developed for the ponds in 2007. In 2011, Horsley Witten was hired by the city to perform a watershed assessment and provide a water quality management plan. As part of that plan, 36 GSI retrofit sites were identified throughout the park. This site shown was located along the edge of Polo Lake. Over time, the shoreline had become degraded due to overuse and aggressive growth of invasive Norway maples. It had also become a popular feeding area for invasive Canada geese, which are a park nuisance and one of the sources of water pollution. Due to these conditions, as well as untreated stormwater runoff from the abutting road that discharged directly to the pond, this site was identified as a good candidate for a wet swale and shoreline restoration. I would like to draw your attention to the sidewalk on the left here and the benches shown here, as they will play a role in our story as we go through the case study. Construction of the wet swale was completed in the summer of 2013. Some things to note: you'll notice the Norway maples were removed, and working closely with the park's landscape architect, it was also decided the sidewalk and benches would be removed as part of the swale project in an effort to change pedestrian circulation patterns in the area. We also had to spend a bit of time with park staff to alleviate concerns that mosquitoes would be a problem, and a deep pool was added to the design. So how does it work? The runoff is diverted from the existing roadway, which is just to the left of this image, and from that structure, the first flush is directed to the wet swale, which is down here, via a stone line conveyance swale. The water then continues through the wet swale to the deep pool and eventually overflows back into the pond via a granite weir. A year later, the wet swale and deep pool vegetation began to take off. However, this is when we first started to notice a few issues such as sediment accumulation at the inlet and along the stone line swale, which was determined to be very difficult to clean and maintain. Also, please note the poor stabilization, just upgrading of the swale. This often occurs post-construction when the practice itself can actually become the main source of sediment and maintenance headaches. Here we are 1 year later in November. I like this photo as I think it's important to consider all 4 seasons and to show the beauty a wetland can provide even in the late fall. And then in November 2016, we noticed a significant change. Although the sidewalk had been removed, people in fact wanted to walk along the edge, and a worn footpath or desire line had appeared just inside the guardrail. The sidewalk had returned. The construction of the sidewalk inadvertently caused two additional maintenance problems. First, stone dust was used between the road and the sidewalk, and the gutter line inlet became clogged with leaf litter, and stormwater overtopped the curb during the largest rain event and washed the stone dust onto the sidewalk and into the swale, clogging it. Second, a small boardwalk had to be constructed at the swale inlet to create the sidewalk and this limited maintenance access to the inlet, as shown in this image here. So now it was much more difficult to clean the swale on a regular basis. So here we are, August 2018, and we're happy to report the wetland is still thriving, but there have been ongoing maintenance issues such as sedimentation and plant growth. Particularly some invasives have appeared, such as smartweed and the Norway maples. We recently worked with park staff and volunteers to thin the plants, remove invasives, and clean the stone swale as part of the training session. I can assure you cleaning the stone swale was no easy task. So here's some wild things we learned about this particular case study. Avoid the use of rock and swales in forebays. As I just mentioned, it is too hard to clean. The designer went out and tried to do it, and even we had a hard time, and we don't recommend using stones and rocks anymore. We also think providing access for people to interact, observe, and learn about nature is a very underutilized or underappreciated aspect of these practices. People love wetlands too. Wet swales are also multifunctional. They can be effective for shoreline restoration, and in this particular application, they were part of the geese habitat elimination. We're also creating a microsystem, and as Michelle mentioned earlier, the mosquitoes are not a problem, although this is a common theme we'll hear from people when designing these practices. And then lastly, a good partner in volunteers, such as Rhody Native, a local native plant group, grew many of the native plants, and 50 volunteers assisted with planting each of the sites. This is a great way to ensure plant availability does not become an issue and you get free labor. And then, of course, my favorite, a bench returns. The park staff noticed visitors like to visit the site, so they decided to put back a bench and add interpretive signage. Although it looks lonely in this picture, I have been told that it's a popular spot, and as you can see here, it can be used to help spread the word about constructed wetlands. This is the photo looking at the site. You can notice the bridge in the background before we started. This is after. So we really feel this was a success. It's multifunctional, provided water quality improvement, shoreline restoration, geese habitat removal, and new habitat, and a park amenity was created.
All right, now we'll move on with Rock the Boat. This case study focuses on a wet swale constructed in 2013 for a small drainage area at a parking lot and boat ramp in Harvard, Massachusetts. Bear Hill Pond is the main water resource in the town and the site of the one town beach. Unfortunately, this freshwater pond, like many throughout the state and in other areas, was impaired for phosphorus. And in fact, there was a TMDL put in place for phosphorus in this area, and it had become murky and overgrown. But because of the impairment, the town received grant funding for water quality efforts in the watershed, including this project. The cost of the wet swale was approximately $80,000 per treated acre. So we worked with the town to perform a watershed assessment to look for the best opportunities for stormwater retrofits in the town center. The town beach was identified as one of the top priority sites. Stormwater runoff from the parking lot and boat ramp flowed directly into the pond without treatment. You can see here. And you can see all the sand buildup here from wind-blown sand. The prevailing winds are coming from this direction. The town wanted to improve the boat ramp as well as capture and treat runoff from the area. Stakeholder engagement is always important for green stormwater infrastructure design, but in this case, it was extremely critical for this beloved space. The town handled this outreach, but opinions and concerns kept changing, and thus so did the design, location, and type. It took months to agree finally on where a wet swale would go and that a wet swale was indeed appropriate. They were very concerned about a wet practice with open water, even in this area surrounded by both wetlands and open water of the pond. But in the end, the design concept was to direct stormwater from the boat ramp into a wet swale. So it flows down here and is directed into the wet swale here that is between a forested area and a kayak rack. So here's the wet swale immediately following construction. There was some continued public concern at this point about the open water in the swale, but as you can see, just 2 months later, the plants are establishing well and starting to fill in. And 2 years later, open water is no longer visible in the swale. I visited this site this fall, 6 years after construction, and the swale is still functioning well. What we found is that thoughtful pretreatment design is really the key to easy maintenance in the long run. The forebay in this specific location is easy to access, which is nice, but the original design included that rock that Brian just mentioned that we no longer use in our pretreatment devices, but was used for this one. It is hard to clean, but if you look at the forebay now, I just was out there this fall, what they've actually done is removed the rock, and now you can see that they come in with basically an excavator and use a bucket to dig out this forebay. So they've made it easier for themselves, and it might not look very good, but it's just a small portion of the total swale and is providing effective pretreatment. The most important pretreatment at this site, though, is actually non-structural. A planted windbreak was installed on the other side of the parking lot to minimize wind-blown sand onto the boat ramp and thus into the swale. This has drastically reduced the amount of sand on the pavement and the amount of maintenance of the forebay. This space has really transformed from a stark parking lot with little visual interest and no habitat to something beautiful and beneficial. And even now, 6 years later, the planted windbreak is flourishing and a lovely addition to the beachfront. So even though the stakeholder engagement and maintenance challenges were a little wild at Bear Hill Pond, the site ended up being a great example of the multifunctional benefits that a constructed wetland can provide. It shows that not only can a stormwater wetland like this provide treatment, but it can be adapted to this parking lot and boat ramp context, placed right alongside active recreational areas, and actually be an asset to a treasured public space. The greatest news for the Bear Hill Pond community is that water quality has improved so much from this and similar efforts in the watershed that the pond is actually no longer listed as impaired for phosphorus as of 2016.
So I have the 2 shallow marsh system case studies, and both of the contexts are on the right-of-way, just as a preview. This project, Life in the Fast Lane, consists of 2 shallow marsh systems that were implemented along Route 6 in Orleans, Massachusetts, which, for those familiar with Route 6, it's a 2-lane divided highway with pretty much no shoulder there. So most of the stuff that we were looking at were BMPs that were located along the outfalls. This is part of Mass DOT's Impaired Waters program. They were looking at addressing nitrogen, and this cost $230,000 per impervious acre, of which we were treating about 2.5 acres, is higher than some of the other ones that you'll see, and that was because we had to implement through this project some improvements to drainage infrastructure that was included in the resurfacing of Route 6 between Dennis and Orleans. The background to this project. Horsley Witten Group was contracted through Mass DOT to evaluate opportunities between Dennis and Orleans for about a year. And through that process, we identified 56 stormwater BMP opportunities, or best management practice opportunities, which included constructed wetlands, wet swales, and other practices. The 2 that are shown here are located in Orleans. And just to give some site context here, one of them is located right next to Cedar Pond. That is associated with this picture on the upper left. As you can see here, a lot of invasives and unmanaged right-of-way. And going a little further to the east towards Orleans, there was another site located just east of the Cape Cod Rail Trail and located next to the seashore Seashore Inn, and they this is sort of an open, managed green space, as you can see in the lower left here, that had connected infrastructure to downstream to a wetland area. Common invasives that we saw in the right-of-way at these two sites, but also other sites that we evaluated, include honeysuckle, common reed, oriental bittersweet, multiflora rose, and black locust. And these invasives were common, like I said, to many of the sites, but also common to many of the right-of-ways that we've seen through many other projects. Similarly, we saw honeysuckle and black locust, hard to see here in the background, as invasives that were kind of key to thinking about what we can do to not only improve stormwater management, but restore both of these sites. Both sites had relatively shallow groundwater location. Of course, being next to Cedar Pond, it's about a foot beneath the ground here and about 40 inches or so, about 4 feet below here. And soils were relatively urban because of the fact that they were in right-of-way context. So this slide shows pictures from the site located next to Cedar Pond. The picture from the upper left is from earlier this April, so right after winter, and these other two photos were just taken this past month in November. From being the sort of degraded right-of-way that was shown previously with a lot of invasives and not really managed well, this system that we've implemented, the shallow marsh system, has allowed this area to be restored to a functioning wetland area. The design of this system, although a little bit difficult to see from the photos, includes a diversion structure up on the road to a sediment forebay located here, and then that is discharged over a weir into a permanent pool. And then any water that exceeds that permanent pool flows back into Cedar Pond, which is sort of in the background here. But as you can see, this system is functioning well, and the growth of the native species, mostly grasses, has been able to help establish the native system as compared to what was there before, which was mostly invasives. And in terms of maintenance, which is important, and I'll talk a little bit about that on the next system, one of the key items here was because of the location of the right-of-way and also the guardrail, we implemented a maintenance access drive to be able to have Mass DOT easily access the system under all conditions. This is the other shallow marsh wetland system, which is located by the Seashore Inn and also just east of the rail trail. The top picture here is from this past April. These bottom two are from November. This system works a little bit differently than the other one I showed you. Runoff enters the system through paved waterways and down through stone spillways into sediment forebays, of which there are two. Those sediment forebays are constructed with granite pavers, which I'll show in another slide, and then that's discharged through a weir into a shallow marsh system. And that then overflows into the wetland that was shown in a previous slide. Oops, sorry. So some wild things that we learned from this, we really wanted to have, and the reason we selected shallow marsh systems for this area was because Mass DOT requested that we look into maintenance as a primary element for the selection of the practices. Many of the practices that we looked at, as I mentioned, were wet swales, but also check dams and other things. So what we wanted to do was we wanted to create something that was easy access and easy maintenance. So again, as I mentioned previously, we created those gravel access drives, but we also created these granite paver sediment forebays, which allows them to easily scoop, shovel, or otherwise remove debris and sediment. And while they were at first hesitant about the functionality of the wetlands, they've been able to see that it's a successful practice and they've been pleasantly surprised by how easy the maintenance is. As far as invasives, as I mentioned, the ability of these systems to restore nature and natural habitat has really been a benefit to both of these implementation practices. This system uses a multi-pronged approach to both take the invasive species off-site, but we also wanted to limit movement of invasive species on-site. So that means that to the extent possible, we limited our impact to adjacent areas where there might be other invasives. And lastly, with the native plant and seed species, we've really created sort of aesthetically pleasing spaces. And while we don't pay much in mind when we're driving along the side of the road, we have received several compliments from bikers and pedestrians along the rail trail. So the next one is the Shallow Marsh. This is another right-of-way system located just south of Louisa Lake in Milford and adjacent to the Upper Charles Rail Trail. This one, unlike some of our other systems, has a very large drainage area, 72 acres, about 21 acres of those being impervious. This project was completed in the summer of 2018, constructed under a 319 grant. First siting of the location was identified under a Sustainable Water Management Initiative grant and looked at BMPs in 5 Upper Charles River communities, Milford being one of them, Bellingham, Medway, Franklin, and Norfolk being the other. And this one was fairly cost effective at $37,000 per impervious acre. So just some key facts about the background to this project. This here is the location of the site, and this is sort of an on-the-ground view of the very densely, mostly invasive public parcel that we identified. You can kind of see it also in the lower left picture. Underneath this public parcel, which used to be an old rail road storage area, there are 2 36-inch stormwater pipes that drain to the lower Huckleberry Brook and then onward to the Milford Pond. And we saw a lot of opportunity here to treat a very large drainage area and also make it a place-making space for the town. Our initial site assessment through using available soils data found that the actual soils were pretty good, high infiltrating capacity, but then during the design phase, which you can see here, we saw something that was a little bit interesting. There was pretty shallow groundwater table. So that we'll play it a little bit more into as we talk about the wild. You can kind of see here, this is a BMP that was located next to this site, actually located right here. This BMP, which appears to be an infiltrating basin, had now become a wetland, which provided some context to us as we were looking at the opportunities. So I won't spend a lot of time on the design of this system, but just speak a little bit to the photos. So this upper photo is from when we completed it last summer. The second photo is it following a rain event. So this kind of gives a little bit of context to what Michelle was speaking to about the deep pools and then the islands. So the deep pools being inundated all the time and the islands not. And then this bottom picture is from May 2019. But what really is the benefit to this practice is the fact that it opened up views to Louisa Lake and offered a lot more safe travel between the Upper Charles Rail Trail and Louisa Lake, and it allowed for more passive and active recreation. And just to speak a little bit about the functionality, there's pre-treatment, the system receives water from a diversion manhole off of the road, which goes through a pre-treatment proprietary water quality unit, and then discharges into the system, overflows then back into the 36-inch stormwater pipe. So just some wild things that we learned, much like Brian said, through the design process, we discussed implementing 2 educational outreach signs to provide information for the residents and homeowners to see what the wetland was supposed to, how it was supposed to function, but also opportunities for them to treat the stormwater at their houses. But more than a few times, we've seen people reading this, whether they're walking their dog or riding their bike. And also we've seen a lot of use just by being there a few times. You can kind of see how the bike tracks through there. So this has become a space that has become well used by humans, but also by animals as well. We've seen ducks, turtles, and frogs on site. And then one step further, the benefit of this practice, not only to the community, but to the city, is that they've taken further steps to enhance access to waterways and the benefit of seeing, you know, the impact of the water quality from the wetland into Huckleberry Brook, which is located here. So very quickly, because I know we're running out of time, some of the wild things that we learned, the soils and the groundwater and site context are very important, and keeping that in mind as we go through from the siting to design process is important. Timing is everything for this project. We had to close the project in June, so we had to plant in May. And if for those who remember, 2018 was kind of a drought year, dry spring, so it was tough for us to get plants to grow. And that also impacted our invasive species management, which we're still kind of dealing with today.
So my old school focuses on a gravel wetland retrofit in the Sawmill Pond Sandhill Brook watershed in North Kingstown, Rhode Island. The context for this project was, you guessed it, a school, as well as a residential neighborhood. It was used as part of a treatment train to address a bacteria impairment. It cost about $100,000 per treated impervious acre. So we worked with the town to perform a watershed assessment to find the best opportunities for stormwater retrofits. This site rose to the top due to its large drainage area, visible location, and existing erosion issues. Stormwater had previously been collected in a closed drainage system on the street, flowing down the road and entering this catch basin here, and then flowing out to the pond untreated. This is the outfall pipe that you can see has been undermined and has fallen apart due to erosion. The wooded area along the pond is a public park with trails, and there's a paved walkway here connecting the neighborhood to the school on this side. The original concept was to install a terrace bioretention system down to the pond to both treat the runoff and stabilize the slope. However, with such a large contributing drainage area, over 11 acres, the available space between the neighbor and the walkway was too small to fully treat the first flush with just the bioretention. The state agency permitting the project wanted to see more treatment here, so we decided to use a gravel wetland actually as a pre-treatment practice to the terrace bioretention. You can see a boardwalk bridge was installed to connect the trail system to the walkway. And here it is several years after construction with well-established plants. A liner was required to hold water in this gravel wetland at the top of the slope. This is such a critical stage in the construction. As you can see here, the contractor just dumped the stone on the liner, and as a result, when they went to do their water tightness test, they failed. The stone had pierced the liner, and so they had to pull it all out and put it back in more carefully. And they had to use these boots around the pipes that entered into the system. So it cost them a lot of time and money. And another important lesson from this project is understanding that when you use an upflow gravel wetland with an already deep existing pipe network, it's going to lead to a very deep excavation downstream and higher cost. You can see the workers here at scale for how deep this terrace bioretention had to be for positive drainage for the treatment train. For gravel wetlands, it's really important to make sure the contractor fills the system with water before or soon after planting. The wetland plants will not be happy if they need to wait for the next rain event or several to get any water. You can see here that when it's not raining, the gravel can look dry, but it is saturated just beneath the surface. And yes, these species do thrive even when planted directly in gravel, as shown in this photo from 3 years after construction. As I've discussed, the wild aspects of this project mainly focused on the challenges of such a complicated treatment train in a tight space and making sure the wetland can stay wet. One unfortunate missed opportunity that I hope will be addressed one day is the lack of public signage and outreach. It's in such a perfect location to educate kids and neighbors alike. In the end, this is a success story showing that collaboration and creative thinking can lead to effective integration of a constructed wetland into the school neighborhood context to meet multiple community goals.
So this is our last case study, and we're coming up on the end of the presentation. So I just want to remind everybody that you can be submitting your questions, and we will have about 10 minutes, I hope, for Q&A at the end of the presentation. So this case study is called In the Mall. It's a gravel wetland built in 2015 for water quality improvements and addressing a TMDL. It's at the Main Mall in Portland, Maine. It was funded with stormwater utility funds through the Long Creek watershed. The cost was $24,000 per acre of impervious cover. And the context for this particular site was a parking lot. So the Main Mall is located in the Long Creek watershed, which is an impaired water body with the pollutant of concern being phosphorus. It's highly developed, and the mall is the largest contributor to the stormwater utility based upon the amount of impervious cover. In 2014, Horsley Witten was hired by the watershed to identify GSI retrofit sites within the mall parking lot. One of the original unmaintained detention basins, which had deteriorated over time, and which had become an eyesore and a nuisance, was identified as a retrofit site. Due to the size of the drainage area, 25 acres, and the available space of the detention basin, it was determined a gravel wetland would be the best choice to both treat and detain runoff. As this was a retrofit, we had to address both of those issues. So this is just a really quick aerial timeline from pre to post construction. What you see here is the detention basin as it existed in 2007. This is the outlet structure, and that's a good point of reference as I click through these. This is what it looked like in 2013. As you can see, unmaintained, it started to fill in, not functioning properly anymore. The structure was still in place. And then in 2015, this was right after the construction of the gravel wetland, which we designed. You'll see that the forebay is in the lower left corner here. The gravel wetland is located in the center. We also have a deep pool for overflow. And then we retrofitted the existing outlet structure to accommodate the changes in flow based upon the gravel wetland design. This photo was then taken in 2018. I want to point out the sediment forebay appears to be doing its job. You can see the water's cloudy when compared to the water in the gravel wetland. I'll point out the standing water in the gravel wetland. If you recall in Michelle's portion of the presentation, she talked about the water elevations, and standing water would indicate that this area was either taken after a rain event or there may be an issue with the outlet structure. And then here, this is what it looks like today in 2019. Again, you can see that sediment forebay doing its job. I would say it does look like it's in need of cleaning based upon what I'm seeing on the side slopes. And then once again, we're starting to see some plants fill in, probably not as much as we would like to see. And we still see this standing water. So this would be an indication that maybe we have an issue with the outlet structure, and this would be a good time to reach out to the client to maybe go and check the site. This is what it looked like during construction. This is us excavating the gravel wetlands. This is installing the gravel. I'm showing these PVC pipes because these are the inspection ports for the chambers that are below the surface in the gravel. This is the gravel wetland installed. Notice the forebay to the left, and also notice that the side slopes have been seeded. We used 3 different seed mixes on this particular site to accommodate the different wetland zones. And then this is what it looked like after a year of stabilization in 2016. Again, some concern with the standing water. This looks like the gravel had either settled and it's not level. Why is that important? That's important because plants will float. So what we did find is the gravel most likely was not graded level, and after installation and water accumulated or filled up the system, the plants then floated and ended along one side of the practice. So we had one area that had a very thick growth of plants, and the other location did not. So therefore, our construction oversight is very important. This is located in a mall parking lot. I think that's important to remember that this was a retrofit of a detention basin, which was an eyesore and was converted to a natural amenity. It is also connected, I show here, to an existing trail network, the South Branch Trail. So because this is now a more naturalized area, it now becomes an amenity to that trail system. It also provides habitat value. As you see in the photo here, that is a dragonfly that we noticed when we were out there. So even though we mentioned they have less habitat value, they certainly do provide significant value compared to what was originally there. and obviously a retrofit of existing basin saves money. This is what it looked like in August of 2016. Again, you still see the standing water, and then in 2017. So again, I would consider this a success. Elimination of a drainage eyesore and a natural amenity was created. This is just a reminder of what this area looked like prior to construction. And then we met water quality improvement goals, restoration, and we certainly provided new habitat and a natural amenity for the community. So just in closing, we hope that what you take away from our presentation today is the multifunctional value and adaptability and versatility of wetlands. Whether it's a wet swale along the waterfront of a historic park, part of a recreational beach and boat ramp improvements project, or shallow marshes located in a road or highway right-of-ways, or a small gravel wetland at a schoolyard, or a large gravel wetland in the edge of a mall parking lot, constructed wetlands can and should be integrated into our built landscapes to provide the much-needed filtration of stormwater runoff, but also to provide healthy native plant communities, habitat, beauty, and opportunities for people to experience and interact with nature. So thank you. We will now take questions, and please let us know if anyone guessed what our theme was.
Excellent. Thank you all for that great presentation. We have several questions. The first is, what size rocks and how deep were the rock layers in the last project that you described?
For the constructed gravel wetland?
Yes.
Yeah, so the rock was, it's just typical angular stone, which is 3 inches to 3/4 inch stone. And Michelle, feel free to chime in. And then the depth of that gravel was, I believe, 2 feet. And then there was, as I mentioned, there were chambers below as well. And the reason why we had to install additional chambers because it was a detention basin. So we had to meet not only water quality goals, but we had to replicate the existing storage that was being that was designed for in that original basin.
And you can use some larger stone. We've had projects where we used 1 to 2 inch stone actually right above the chambers, and that provides good storage volume amongst that stone. And then just, I would recommend using a top layer, at least 6 inches of the pea stone, the smaller stone, because it provides a good bedding for the plants until they can get fully established.
All right, very good. Can you give a couple of examples of the plants that were best at preventing erosion, providing habitat, and improving water quality?
That's a good question. So on the erosion side of things, for most of the practices that we showed today, seed mixes were used for the majority of the side slope stabilization, and then maybe supplementing with some plantings. I think the most important thing to consider when working with these types of practices is you have to account for the fluctuation of water in the different zones. That's been an issue that we've seen on different practices where maybe during construction, the zones weren't exactly as they were shown on the plan. So it's really important that they make sure that they're planted in the right zone. I know from the gravel wetlands and a lot of the wet swales, sedges and rushes are the plant of choice. There's quite a different list of varieties that you can use depending upon, again, that context question. And then the main mall presented some additional challenges because it's a colder climate. I do know we had failure of one particular rush that I can't recall right now, but there was one plant that did not do well, and we think it's because we were in too cold of a climate. Anyone else want to add to that?
Well, I'd mentioned earlier for the gravel wetlands, bulrush, soft rush, tussock sedge, we've had success with planting directly in the gravel. And then for some of the other projects, it can range based on that depth regime. You can have, even on the side slopes, as you get a little bit further up, we planted some vaccinium, some blueberry. Always blue flag iris is good in some of the zones. I see some
that's
cardinal flower.
That's a good point. We also planted aronia and clethra alnifolia at the wet swale at Roger Williams Park. I think just one other thing I want to add about that erosion issue. The other thing that can really help you in these situations, if you have the available space, is if you can grade to 4-to-1 or greater slopes.
Mm-hmm.
Well, we found 2-to-1 is a real challenge, and actually we wouldn't recommend it at all unless it's an absolute necessity, or maybe go to stepping the system. But 4-to-1 and 3-to-1 can work, but ideally 4-to-1 is preferred, and then 5-to-1 or greater. And not only that, it allows you to blend it into the surrounding landscape and really give it a much more natural appearance and get away from maybe that more engineered look that you would get with a detention basin. So I hope that answered the question.
Can I add one more thing? One of the things that we did for the project down in the corner in Milford was that because we had construction between fall and spring, we added a winter rye to help the stabilization for ours and help that as the native seed establishes, because as I understand, it takes about a year or more for a lot of those native seeds to start to go.
All right, very good. Is there any place that you would recommend as a resource for a plant list for what worked in various situations?
Well, I will just say that with all of these practices, the plant list is really pretty easy because you can just go and pull out that planting cross-section that showed the different zones, because really what you're doing is you're planting a wetland community. And the other really big advantage to that, and we didn't touch on it too much, but it really is a self-sustaining plant community. And we've been doing this GSI stuff for a while now, and in our experience, the wet practices have by far had the most vibrant and self-sustaining and self-maintaining plant communities. Really the biggest issue we've had is thinning out plants, as I mentioned, and then we have had issues with invasives, but again, that self-sustaining plant community that is established really is a good regulator of invasive species too. So it's really a built-in invasive species management.
Yeah, there's only a few invasives that can handle that depth of water, so it really minimizes that.
Yeah, so if you can have a wetland biologist on the team helping you out with maybe plant selection, or again, just going to any sort of good resource for wetland plants.
All right, very good. The next question is, what programs do you use for designing the wetlands? And the question goes on to ask, is it HydroCAD?
So it's a combination of things, but yeah, HydroCAD is usually one of the programs used. There's some, we have some sizing spreadsheets that are based upon different manuals for different states. You know, we used the Rhode Island manual as an example. I'm not sure, I don't recall. I don't think Maine really had strict guidance on gravel wetlands, but that's probably the starting point to see what's required. But HydroCAD is certainly a very effective tool to help model, especially when you're dealing with like with that gravel wetland that had the storage underneath it as well. I don't know if Michelle, do you want to add, or Jen?
Yeah, for this shallow marsh system, there's some guidance surface area at certain depths that you should use. So 40% of the shallow marsh should be high marsh versus low marsh. I think that's actually, I'm not sure if it's in the Massachusetts Stormwater Manual, but it's definitely in the Rhode Island Stormwater Manual. And that's what we use to try to get the most effective shallow marsh system. For wet swales, if it's just for water quality, you're basically just providing the volume for the 1 inch of runoff within your wet swale.
And you get to take credit for the water that's in it, the pools.
Yes, you take credit
so
for the water within the permanent pools. It does not have to be empty space. Basically, these work by displacing the water that's already in there as new water flows through. Right,
and that's a slightly different from, you know, the drier practices when that water quality volume is really above the surface and what you're trying to provide an infiltration, where with the wet practices you get to take credit for that, that you're intercepting the groundwater.
Okay, the next is about the pricing. One comment was thank you for sharing your cost estimates, and another is a question, Have you found any consistency in the budget pricing between the various BMPs you discussed, since there seems to be a wide range of costs?
So I just had this conversation this morning on a different type of issue, but so with green stormwater infrastructure, the variability in cost has a lot of, it factors into the existing conditions, what you're trying to accomplish in your goals, the amenities. Take, for example, the wetland in Roger Williams Park. That was pretty high cost relative to like the gravel wetland in the main mall. And a lot of that was to do, number one is the economy of scale, right? The bigger the practice, there's still built-in construction costs that it doesn't matter what size the practice is, that you still have to pay for. But then I think what the materials you use also can factor into it as well. That's probably not a great answer.
Well, I think the wide range of costs in these case studies are probably due to the fact that they are all retrofits. The main mall was a retrofit of an existing practice, but the rest of them were retrofits of existing sites that had uses already and utilities in place. And so there's a lot of variability in how much work it takes to get a constructed wetland into these already developed spaces.
So that is a much better answer, because that also relates to Roger Williams Park, because we had to take out the bench, the trees, and we were taking it from one type of use to another.
Right. And
it was two completely different uses, where the wetland, the main mall, was already a hole in the ground, to use Michelle's terminology.
Well, in Sawmill Pond, that project, if you were doing that from the beginning of construction of the neighborhood and school, it would never need to be that deep or complicated. So much of that cost was due because those uses were already there and we just had to work around them. The pipe network was already in place. If you built that from new construction, it would have been much, much cheaper.
Okay. The next is on mosquitoes. You mentioned that there wasn't a problem with most of your sites. Are there any research studies that you can refer us to?
Research studies, no. The case studies we presented, I think people could reference. And you know, if anyone has an issue with that, they could certainly call any of those, like Roger Williams Park, and call the Parks Department, because that was one of the comments we got, that the former Parks Director, we said he was surprised that the mosquitoes were an issue. And honestly, that was part of the reason why we moved that sidewalk too, because they were concerned about bringing people in, that it would be a mosquito breeding ground. I think the data is, if done correctly, you are creating these micro ecosystems that should, right, again, just like with the invasive species, you're not only providing habitat for plants, but there's also critters and amphibians and different animals that end up living in these communities that then can help keep the mosquitoes at bay. And in fact, it's, you know, wetlands are known to have less mosquitoes, or healthy wetlands, because of that fact.
Yeah, and actually I would say conversely, catch basins, which are pretty much everywhere, are actually the most prolific of mosquitoes, because of their shallow, wet areas and their ability to produce mosquitoes. So I think that's just a misconception, and I do think actually there are studies.
There are certainly studies on both of these topics that we just don't have at our fingertips, unfortunately. We should get those. I have read those research papers, but I don't have them at the top of my head.
We usually just tell our clients to trust us.
Just kidding.
Very good. The next few questions are about maintenance. One is, are you regularly having to clean out constructed wetlands? And another related question is, are municipal DPWs able to keep up with the maintenance of constructed wetlands?
So I can tell you that the case studies I presented have not been made. Well, the one in Roger Williams Park has been, but very infrequently, and I'm pretty certain that the main mall has not. As long as you provide sufficient forebay, we think the maintenance is pretty minimal on these practices compared to some of the other things we've worked on. Again, that goes back to the whole plant community, and it's really making sure you capture the sediment and keep it out of the practice, because the sediment's going to be the thing that causes the most problems. Slightly different than like bioretention, when you start to get weeds, and it has sometimes a more ornamental value. But yeah, it's pretty infrequent. The municipalities are on board to maintain these, just like with all GSI, they are reluctant.
Yeah, and that's so for the down in the corner, the Milford one, that's also why they requested a water quality treatment unit, although that was also designed because of lack of space, but because they were more comfortable with using a vac truck to maintain that than having to clean out a forebay. Both of the practices that I presented, the shallow marshes, are new. We have been out there in the last year to kind of see how things have been working, and they've been working well, but that certainly is something that will be interesting to see over time, how both Mass DOT and in this case the town of Milford does their maintenance. But we provide as designers, we provide operation and maintenance guides for our projects with the intent of trying to guide, and you saw the picture of Brian walking through with folks about maintenance and how they function, and we try to do that and be diligent about that while we're working with them, because that is one of the key aspects of any practice, but constructed wetlands in particular, is really communicating how these function and how they need to be maintained so that there isn't a failure in the future.
Right, I think that's the O&M plan is a good point, and not just the maintenance requirements, but how it functions. So what we've done is we've adapted sort of those principles to our O&Ms, where we spend a bit of time up front explaining the function, because what we found out that a lot of the people who were providing the maintenance didn't understand what it was they were maintaining. And that in itself becomes a problem. And there are certain things you can do to certainly lessen your maintenance burden if you understand how it's functioning. And for example, just making sure the water can get into the practice. The Roger Williams Park is a classic one where their inlet was clogged. They didn't clear it. A big storm came, overtopped, and washed all that sediment in there, which wouldn't have been there if they were able to clean the inlet prior to the storm.
Okay, very good. Do the deep pools need to be fenced like swimming pools?
No. Nope. We've never had. They're usually, the Roger Williams Park deep pool was probably 18 inches, maybe 18 inches to 2 feet. I don't know what it was at Bear Hill Pond.
For Bear Hill Pond, it was pretty shallow. I think it was only 18 inches, but for systems, yours must have been bigger.
Ours was about 4 feet total depth, but as you saw from the photos, our groundwater levels are a little low right now, so that is an impact. Although we did get asked the question, should we fence the practice, because we had a stone dust path around it. And I think we came to the fact that, because of the design, overall design, and the consideration of the, height of what will be the primitive pool versus, the stormwater, that it wasn't deep enough to warrant concern.
And when we do have deep pools like that, we work in these safety benches, these aquatic benches, so that it's not such a dramatic safety concern. So you've got kind of a gradual change, and then a flat bench, so if anyone did fall in, that they could get out pretty easily. I did have to fence in at the sawmill project. We saw how very deep that was next to the school and a neighbor, but that was more due to the side slopes. That it wasn't the deep pools at that point, but just to keep people from falling down those steep side slopes.
Okay. The next question is about fabrics. Do you regularly use things like corn netting?
Like on the bottom or side slopes? I guess you probably can't clarify that question, but I think that really depends. I know that Michelle talked a little bit about a liner for the gravel wetland, and we do sometimes use liners depending on, location of the groundwater. In the case of my practices, the Milford one being shallow, but maybe not shallow enough. That's why you see those pictures. It's not totally full of water like some of the other ones that we've seen. And we decided not to use an impermeable liner in that case to be able to have that fluctuation of groundwater. And that is typically the case with a lot of these shallow marsh and wet swale systems.
So we have used coil logs in the Roger Williams Park project for part of the shoreline restoration work, and I have used like coil fabric or jute netting in the past to help on side slope stabilization, or it wasn't a project we presented, but it was another constructed wetland where there was a saddle in between two deep pools, and we used the coil fabric to hold the plants in place between the saddle, and that goes back to that the plant floating issue. I didn't mention this in the presentation, and it wasn't part of one of these case studies, but there's also just another tip that probably would be valuable for people listening. To prevent plants from floating, what we've seen installers do, and I think it's a great idea, is they put the wetland plant in a little burlap bag with just a little bit of gravel, and then they just plop the plants into the wetland. It takes them a little longer to establish and get their roots, but it holds them in place. And we just did that on a project, and it seems to be pretty effective. So I thought that was a pretty creative solution. That landscape contractor was actually a nursery as well, so they had the manpower to sort of do that. Yeah. Not every landscape contractor may have that manpower, but I thought that was a pretty unique solution to try to keep the plants in place, and it seems to be working.
Very good.
Yeah.
On the first slide, you mentioned not to use rocks because of maintenance issues. So what were you using in place of rocks?
So I guess if we're looking at that particular case study, in hindsight, I probably would have used some sort of reinforced turf material for scour protection. We would have needed something just because of flows and velocity would have caused erosion over time. We've also used pavers. Mm-hmm. I know Roger Williams Park is very fond of pavers in the sediment forebay now because they're the ones who said we'll never clean rock swales again. So yeah, different. We use this product called what is it called? Grass.
It's grass pave.
Grass pave. Yeah. No, not grass pave.
Something similar.
Yeah. But any sort of permeable paver, there's a bunch of different options out there. It's a good solution for a forebay. We've done things with mortared cobbles and then having just the area that allows it to drain. So things that someone can kind of scoop in with the shovel. The other thing we have heard that people like, in particular like DOTs, is by putting a harder surface down there, not just hand-placed stone, it lets them know when they've hit the bottom. Mm-hmm. Instead of, so when they're in there and they're scooping it out, they know that they've hit the bottom and they don't need to go any further.
Good, very good. The next question is about pond liners. How long do you expect them to last?
Pond liners, how long do we expect them to last?
As long as they're not exposed to the sunlight, they should last for a very long time, I would say.
Yeah.
The life of the practice.
Definitely the life of the practice. Yeah. So 20 or more years.
Yeah, and then to keep in mind, you can also use a clay liner.
You can. We had some feedback on that it's very hard in this area to get clay to use as a liner. But yes, you can use that instead if available.
Okay. The next is a design question. Is there a reason for the contours versus straighter, smoother edges?
I'm not say that again. Is there a reason for the contours versus straighter, smoother edges?
For contour designs, meaning, do you find there are more advantages for undulating the contours rather than smooth, straight contours?
Yes. There's many reasons. Obviously, smooth, straight contour lines, sometimes you have to factor that in if you're in a tight space. But in general, just undulating and sort of, again, mimicking nature or the natural, how you would see the landscape in the natural environment is the first option. And then keep in mind these different benches that Michelle mentioned, or undulating, or these different pockets provide different habitat value, and you might get different plant communities in these different locations. So I think there's a lot of benefits to being able to have a more organic feel with the grading and the shape. Having said that, we realize that not every project will allow you to be that creative.
Well, and depending on the context, you might want to use the straighter edges. If you're in a more urban location, it might fit in better to the surrounding area and use to have it. So you can certainly use straighter edges for something like that. And of course, a gravel wetland can easily be done with more, like you could almost use a concrete wall or curbing or whatnot as the edge of that, depending on your space. But certainly with a shallow marsh system with more space, I think there's a lot of benefit to mimicking nature.
Yeah, the straight edge would be best with the gravel wetland or the wet swale if it's in an urban context.
Yep.
All right. Can you provide a suggestion for where information on grant funding might be researched that you mentioned?
The majority of our projects, I think, were funded through the 319 grant program, which is basically facilitated through the state, depending whether it was Rhode Island or Massachusetts. And that is, I believe, Clean Water Act federal funding that goes to each of the states. They do have, they're getting a little more stringent on the requirements to use that funding. For example, if you're trying to do a project that is required from another program, like the MS4 program that Jen mentioned, I think there are some limitations in using that type of funding. But I feel like it's still a possibility for some of these projects.
Yeah, I mean, we've also used coastal zone management for implementation of some projects. I think, in fact, we're working on one now in Kingston, Mass. But I think actually a lot of the grant funding that we've received through these projects is for planning purposes, which has come through various grant opportunities. One, as I mentioned, was the Sustainable Water Management Initiative, which is through the Water Management Act. And there are several others that we've used. And then the MSDOT was in a grant that was through their budget funding.
EPA has different grant funds available. I know that we're building a gravel wetland right now through the SNEP grant, and that's Southeast New England Watershed Program, that they have funds that are available every year that people can write grants for.
I guess I would also add that just because the funding is becoming a bit more of a challenge, that finding partnerships between different municipalities or different agencies. We just completed a project in Roger Williams Park where it was 2 of the sites identified in that water quality management plan were actually constructed by the DOT because they were taking DOT road runoff. And then the unique thing about that is they've also partnered on the maintenance requirements, and they've sort of divided and conquered and say, the parks, you guys are a little bit better at maintaining the planted portion, we'll maintain the more structured portions, and the design was sort of tailored to meet those requirements. But any sort of watershed organizations are also good partners as well. So I think, being a little more creative, so we're not all sort of targeting the same pool and maybe teaming together just because the pool of resources is limited.
Yeah, and on that note, I think MVP grant implementation money,
what is
some
MVP?
of the FEMA, Municipal Vulnerability Preparedness Grant, and some of the other FEMA funding, which is through your hazard mitigation planning efforts, also can provide sources, although both of those require sort of a planning process that is pretty prescriptive. A lot of these resources, I do believe, actually are online, and perhaps we can follow up with Penny on that after this.
Yeah, I'm not sure if, unfortunately, it would all be in one location, but because it also depends on the context, right? Like if you have a park where you want to do something like this, there are a lot of times park grants that you could go for. If you want to associate it with a trail project, there are trail funding grants available. So you kind of get creative with, depending on where your site is and the type of project that you want to do or tie it together with. There can be a lot of opportunities.
There was one submission for the theme. Was the theme classic rock songs?
Well, there was one song in there that was not, well, I guess it depends on what your definition of classic rock is. Seeing that I'm the oldest one here that presented, there was one song in there I would not classify as classic rock, but they are all songs. So
nice work.
Good job, whoever that was. When we give the presentation, we usually have a prize, but this is a webinar, so we can't.
The prize is an air high five.
No.
Well, thanks to Jeremiah for submitting that response. Thank you so much for all of this amazing information. We loved all of the case studies. That was such a helpful way for you to present and demonstrate to us the various options and solutions. So thank you all very much for your time and doing this presentation for us.
All right.
It was our pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you very much.